Good afternoon. My name is Vasilis Lambropoulos. I teach Greek in the departments of classical studies and comparative literature. And I have to admit, I thought I was going to walk into this room and find only two people, given this kind of weather, really challenging. So I'm very happy to see all of you here this afternoon. We have a very special speaker in this wonderful series of the European Center, the series on conversations on Europe. And in one way or another, including yesterday and today, Europe, of course, is making headline news of all kinds. Right now in Ukraine. Our speaker is Peter Bratsis, who is an assistant professor of political science in the Borough of Manhattan Community College. And he's a very interesting scholar, and he's also a very interesting public intellectual. So he has there was this op-ed that Christoph published in the New York Times about the absence of academics from the public sphere, and there has been a certain controversy, some people supporting him and more people, I guess, disagreeing with him. But Peter is one case which proves that this is not the case, and there are many of us who are through books, articles, activism, and so on, engaged in the public political sphere. Just a few quick words. His publications include the book Everyday Life and the State, and a book co-authored with Stanley Aronovich, Paradigm Lost, State Theory Reconsidered. Peter has a very interesting argument about the continued relevance of the state, something that political theory and even activism seem to have left behind, but he argues to me quite convincingly that its relevance is still very important. And he has two projects, and I will mention my favorite one, which is 20 Years of Boredom, Veganism, and the Cultural Logic of Late Liberalism. Now, this has the potential of a real bestseller, whether people love it or hate it, probably hate it. But a book against veganism is long overdue, and I think that's my bias. But nobody is in a better position from a political, economical, philosophical angle to address this issue than Peter. Unfortunately, he's not talking about this today, but we'll bring him back soon. His topic today is Civilization Gone Awry, Culture, Capitalism, and Conflict in Contemporary Europe. Peter Bratsis.
Thank you very much, Vasily. I really appreciate the invitation to come here, and to Joshua as well. It's an honor for me to be in Ann Arbor, and I expected like 5-6 people as well. If I knew so many, I would have been more nervous, but luckily I didn't expect that. The veganism is I'm not against veganism. I mean, the project is mainly on how we go from understanding the distinction between the humans and the animals on the level of cogito, of thinking, in Aristotle, Descartes. The whole philosophical tradition was, do only humans think, or animals can think a little bit, or some can and some can't, maybe the plants can think, to one of sentience, of pain, as a dividing line. And there, it is I think at least, an interesting transformation that occurs, that the way people think of the humans, the animals now, is in terms of, can they feel pain? Are they sentient? If so, then we cannot eat them. Hitler even had some laws like that, that if you cook the lobster, the water has to be at least 100 degrees Celsius, and you put it with the head first, because if you put the lobster with the tail, it may feel a moment of pain before it's cooked. So you have to do things in a way to minimize pain, which has, that's not the topic for today, but it has many implications. What I want to talk about today is Europe, and I write some things on Europe and on Greece. Unfortunately, anything good I had on the Greek situation, I had already given us a talk, and now they record the talks and they put them on YouTube. So you cannot give the same talk again and again. It becomes, the Greeks have shame, not guilt. I would do it if not for the cameras, but the shame is not good. So I came up with something new, and this is a work in progress. I have notes. I'm going to make there's about 8 parts to what I want to present today. I'm not going to read a text. Hopefully I will not take an hour. Hopefully it will be less. And we will have some time to have discussions and talk, because I will cover a wide range of topics. So, hopefully many people can find something within the range that is interesting or important, and we can talk about. The point of departure, really, for the paper is the observation, or at least the possibility, the tendency, that the way economic integration functions in Europe, and more generally, probably, but in Europe and specifically, has changed. And it's important to note that the beginning of the European Union is a project to have increased economic interdependencies as a political project, as a way of mitigating antagonism and conflict within Europe. Specifically Germany and France, but more generally as well. And in 1950, the French foreign minister gave a famous talk where he outlined the project that then, 51, became the Treaty of Paris. And what we know now as the European Union really follows from that. And let me read from you from the speech that Robert Schuman gave in 1950 as to explaining why have economic interdependencies. And he says, "This merging of our interests in coal and steel production and our joint action will make it plain that any war between France and Germany becomes not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. The establishment of this powerful unity for production, open to all countries willing to take part, and eventually capable of providing all the member countries with the basic elements of industrial production on the same terms, will cast a real foundation for their economic unification. In this way, simply and speedily, the fusion of interests, which is vital for the establishment of a common economic system, will be realized. Thus, the leaven will be introduced which will permeate and build a wider and deeper community between countries that had continually opposed each other in bloody divisions." And this is not a new idea, obviously, that the more economically intertwined and interdependent cultural groups are, nations are, people are, the less likely there is to be significant conflicts and antagonisms. I'm reminded, because of being in the area, there's a very nice documentary on the Detroit, on DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, which was a radical Marxist black movement in the Dodge main factory, and then it spread to Ford and many others. And at one point, one of their spokespeople, one of the leading drum people, makes the argument that some black people have the fear that the Americans will send all the black people back to Africa, or they're going to. But America needs the black. Who's going to drive the buses? He says, right? Who's going to build the cars? It's a necessary population. Interdependency precludes stark conflicts and antagonisms the way that some people, maybe not anymore, because some things change. And there was a nice editorial recently by David Simon, who created The Wire, the television show. where he says now we have increasingly 10-15% surplus population. No interdependencies, in other words, among increasingly a high percentage of the population. So the beginning of Europe begins as a political project, not as an economic project. The economics are necessary, both in the sense that in general, of course, growth and prosperity are seen as good things in themselves, but fundamentally as a way of mitigating conflict and mitigating antagonisms within the peoples of Europe, at least as a start. One irony or paradox in the current situation, however, is that, number one, we have a turn towards increasingly antagonistic and conflictual relations within the European Union. And in many cases, it is not despite of, but because of the economic interdependencies and integrations. This is very different. And if you look to, there are many, many examples, but if you look to the north of Europe, in Germany, in the UK, the Danes and so forth, it is, of course, the lazy Greeks and the rest of the pigs, the Italians and the Spanish and the Greeks. Sometimes but the Irish aren't really pigs because they're too Protestant, They're Protestantized Catholics. The real pigs are the Southerners. And the problem is, of course, because of economic interdependencies, the German people have to work more, or they have these problems because the Greeks and the Italians like to have their siestas and enjoy the sunshine. And now they're interdependent, so the excesses of the Southerners are paid by the Northerners. And there are many, many anecdotal stories now, of course, about, I don't know if they're all true. Some may be true. German tourists who come to Greece, and they say then they go and they order, fish and lobsters, and then they say, oh, we don't have to pay the bill because you owe us money. It's already been paid. Or one story I heard, I don't know if it's true, but that they tell these stories now in and of itself is indicative that there was some wedding in Crete in one of the villages, and there were some German tourists, and the people invited them come to the wedding, and there were lambs being cooked and plenty of wines. And then at the end, that's why the Germans then said to the Greeks, you owe all the money because look how you live with wines. And I don't think the Cretans responded well to the insult. So it's the interdependency now increasingly that becomes a source of conflict. And it's also true on the other side. If you look at the literature from the other standpoint, and maybe the best book on this is Kostas Lapavitsas and his crew of economists at the SOAS, School of Oriental Asian Studies in London. The argument is that the suffering of the South is because of the economic integration, that there is a core-periphery relationship now functioning in the Eurozone, and wealth is extracted from the South through monetary policies and through the terms of trade that have come about within the Euro. So the source of economic problems in Greece is the economic interdependency, is the way that the periphery of the Eurozone, not only in Greece, but the whole periphery of the Eurozone is now we have, like in the old days of dependency theory, core-periphery relations, and there's an extraction of wealth from the periphery towards the core. So again, it's an interesting transformation that economic integration, interdependencies, go from being the key mechanism through which antagonisms and political cooperations are policed or regulated, and we have more and more coordination. And yes, there are differences, but not the kinds of conflicts and antagonisms that may lead to wars and other kinds of conflict, to now the opposite. And this is, I think, a tendency we can debate how true or not true this is, but I think is increasingly clear that the old assumptions no longer hold, that the way things work now is different. And the way I thought about trying to make sense of this problem or this dilemma, is to go back to Norbert Elias. And Elias, as some of you may know, wrote, among other things, a very wonderful book on the civilizing process. And the civilizing process, he argues, comes about because of increased economic interdependencies. Elias's argument is that beginning in roughly the 12th century or so, moving forward, within Europe, you have an increased use of money, increasingly complex divisions of labor and interdependencies within communities and between communities. And this triggers a transformation in popular culture. Principally, what now happens is because now is not only a little town that's self-sufficient or a family, we have our farm and we have, now, like us today, of course, even more so, us being here presupposes hundreds of thousands, millions of people doing their part, right? I mean, the way how we have lights. We didn't make the light bulbs. We didn't make the electricity, right? Who picked the coffee beans? Not you, not me. Yeah, somebody somewhere. And how can we trust that these people are going to get up in the morning and do their part? How can we trust that in the mountains of Colombia or in, Kenya or whatever it is the coffee beans come from, these people are going to get up in the morning and even when the weather is not the best and do their part? And how do we know the bus drivers will show up? So, Elias says, increasingly there is a need for societies to develop cultural forms that do two things principally. Train the self to be able to control their animal urges. We'll back a little bit to the animals. How, because, what does it mean? Why table manners? Some people think table manners is about hygiene. You don't get germs, nothing to do with that. Why, he says? Because when they bring you the food, if you just grab the food like that and start eating, that's no good. It shows you're like an animal. You give in directly to your urges. You're hungry, yeah, but you have to wait. And you take the knife and the fork, and you cut, in a slow and civilized way, and you eat. So it's a way of training the self. It's also a sign to the others that you can be counted upon. They can trust you to do your part. The handkerchief. Things then like privacy. Suddenly people want to have separate bedrooms. And they wear night clothes, gowns, for... And some, of course, of the things he gives as examples are very humorous because there were, for example, guides for, when your guests come and you're in bed, don't relieve yourself because that would not be, nice to the guests. Leave and go out to the next room to relieve yourself because it's not. But increasingly then separate rooms and separate clothes. And why? To move away as much as possible from the animal instinct of it's, you're hungry and you want to eat like that, or anything having to do with the animal side of our existence. From sex, of course, to eating, to everything else. And this became what became known as civilization, right? The civilized are able to be not like that, to be controlled, to speak in certain ways, not to get very angry. Like the Greeks, if the Greeks lack civilization, sometimes it's because they're too emotional. You see, they talk with the hands and they raise the voice. And no good. The way we eat the food. Why? He makes the observation. When the animal carcass hangs in the window, people find that revolting increasingly. Because it's too reminiscent of our animal nature. You want it wrapped in cellophane in a form that does not resemble the animal. That's the point. So it's not like you're eating a cow in that you see the animal like that. It's a piece of meat that bears no resemblance to the animal. And there are many, it's a very fascinating book, very interesting book. So for Elias, the macro transformations that occur, and you have a transformation of society from a feudal simple, rural, agricultural, to increasingly urban, interdependent, complex, there's a micro and a macro level to it. And of course, there are macro transformations, the rise of the nation state, most principally, among other things. And there's also, on the level of daily life and lived experiences, a very important transformation. So here, I think, is the most developed understanding as to why economic interdependencies should be expected to result in more cooperation and cohesion. I mean, then he gives examples, for example, from literature and art. And he says, look before and look after. Before, there were examples of stark differences, black and white. The people next to us who are horrible and they should be slaughtered and killed, to increasingly shades of gray you have now. Antagonists have become not absolute, but relative and always measured. And he gives examples from literature and the art world and so forth. And you would think then that, when you have, in terms of Europe, certainly, when you have an economic integration the way that exists in Europe, that would mean, of course, less and less black and white, more cooperation. That, again, increasingly seems not to be the case. Now, just as we know from Elias, and he has another book which is very interesting on this, The Germans, where he tries to make, because some people then said, because this book comes out in 1939, The Civilizing Process. Then, of course, you have, among other things, the Holocaust. And so some people say, wait a minute, how can you say that we live in an age of increasing, of these things happen, and then you have, well, he says, well, because the process can go both ways. Things can be reversed. And he wrote a book then, The Germans, was published after he had passed away, where he has some arguments as to what happens in Germany, and the civilizing process breaks down. You have a decivilizing moment that occurs, through Weimar, then in the Nazi era. So I look to see, well, what happens today, perhaps, that increasingly the nature of economic interdependency changes, and the nature of of popular culture changes. So rather than tying us more and more together, stronger forms of collaboration and coordination and political unity, we become more and more antagonistic and isolated. And I came up with two fundamental reasons. The first of which has to do from a transformation of putting what Freud would call aim-inhibited libido, so libidinal energy in things other than sexual life. Right? So Freud asks the question, one of the questions he asks in Civilization's Discontents and other places, why do all human societies place such severe limitations on sexuality? When that's really the measure of pleasure, in a sense, right? That's the absolute, the best we know. That's the. So he says, why does that happen? And he says, well, the reason why is because human beings also have a tendency towards destruction and death. And the reason why we don't kill each other is not enough simply that it's in our mutual interest, that we're neighbors and, you help me if I have a problem and vice versa, so it's not useful for me to kill you. That's not enough, he says. The reason why is because we're tied together in a libidinal way. We get pleasure from being part of the community. So you have to limit sexual life, because all of that, if you spent all that energy on sex, you'll be nothing left over for the community realm, the social realm. It's like if you have some friend that gets a new boyfriend or girlfriend, maybe they disappear for 2-3 months. You don't see them for a while. You see what I mean? That's the Freud understood that process very well. So there's limitations. So you put that energy into work, into the football games. You see, all these things are aim-inhibited libido, and that ties together the community in a very strong way. He says that's a very strong connection, and that's why we may kill other people. We may drop the bombs of love and democracy on on the Iraqis or on or on Libya, but among us, right? There is a strong connection, and we have a problem. And we have a problem. The same is true in Elias, because why? What's the draw, let's say, of going to work in the morning on time, and when the guests come, you're going to give the guests the best piece of meat. You're going to give them the first choice. You're not going to give them the worst and keep the best for yourself. But what's the draw for that? Well, you get pleasure from that. That's a source of satisfaction. And Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, that's his definition of enjoyment, is the pleasure you get from denying yourself pleasure. Do you understand? That's what he calls the jouissance. So when the guests come and you're a very good host, like the Greeks pride themselves, right? This is, philotimo is a traditional Greek value, that how well you treat the guests, the others. That's a source of pride and satisfaction. Now, there may be, of course, there's a level of utility to it as well, because, these things, of course, is like gifts. When you're nice to other people are also nice to you, but there's a libidinal moment there. But popular culture changes dramatically after the 1930s. And it changes dramatically, in many ways, potentially. One way I want to highlight, which is the rise of what in economics, or some economics, they call Fordism or monopoly capitalism. And you have a shift to societies of mass production and mass consumption. Again, here we're at this is the ground zero for Henry Ford and all the rest. But the idea is, of course, now that you have systems of mass production, you've got to have mass consumption. And one of those ways that happens, paradoxically, people using Freud, is that libidinal energy is displaced to the realm of consumption. And here is an interesting, irony, that is people reading Freud that were some of the first to say, well, there's a marketability in the idea. We can make a lot of money using Freud because we can. And the first focus group, from what I've read, was a Freudian analyst who was brought in by Duncan Hines or Betty Crocker, whoever who was. They came up with the instant cake mix. And they had done research, and they found that 99.9% of American housewives said they would buy a mix, and they thought they were going to make a lot of money. They make the cake mixes, and no one buys the cake mix. So they didn't know what to do. They brought in the Freudians, and they did a focus group, based on group. They did a group analysis, but then became a focus group. And the recommendation was make them break an egg. So you get the mix, and then you have to crack an egg and mix it together with the water or whatever else you put in there. And they did that, and the sales went through the roof because of guilt. They were too guilt. It was too much guilt. You're not suffering. That's the jouissance. You're not suffering enough for the family. It's too easy just to put the water. You put the egg, the sales go through the roof because it's more like actual cooking. You have to break the egg, and there's some energy to mix it together. So this is a fundamental transformation, because now, rather than all the libidinal energy that is displaced from sexual life, being focused upon these community activities, the bowling and hanging out with your friends at in the cafes or in the bars, or the family potentially, and so forth. Now, more and more energy is diverted into the realm of consumption, to the market. So less and less is placed upon these, what Freud and Elias took as a given, that if you take it from sex, you're going to put it into these social activities, which was true for a long, long time. But now more and more and more, you are obliged to divert much of that energy into consumption. So that becomes a significant transformation. And not that people did not buy things before; they may have bought things, but the source of satisfaction was not in the buying of the things per se. I remember when I was young in Athens, every day my grandmother would take me and we would do the rounds in the neighborhood. And you stop and you get the bread from the baker. And you would stop at the butcher and get, then maybe stop at some relative's house for a coffee. And there was, I'm sure there was, that was a source of satisfaction, but it wasn't because you buy the bread. It was because you know the baker and you know the butcher and, you exchange pleasantries. You see the neighborhood people, then. Now, of course, it's very different. You have, to begin with, increasing, even though we have cities still, the suburbanization of cities in many ways. In Europe, more true here, of course, because America is very advanced, but also in Europe this happens. In Athens now, it's many things in Athens now are depressing, including the fact that for many people, many of the Greeks have left the center of Athens. They live in the suburbs surrounding it. And the way you shop is you get in the car and you go to a mall, and there's some big French or German supermarket, and you put the euro in the thing to get a cart, and you fill up the cart, and then you carry the bags back to the car. Even in New York now, they Americanize the supermarkets. Because the New York supermarkets are based upon urban principles. So you go to the traditional New York markets, Zabar's, Fairway, Cinderella, they are packed. You're bumping into people. There are things, the shelves are, packed with things. People bump into you. You go to Whole Foods in Manhattan. You know how it is? Big aisles, wide open. It's a suburban aesthetic, but what's the principle? Not to bump into the people. Not to bump into other people shopping, so you're left alone. Which is the same aesthetic many times of suburban life, to have big yards and big houses, so you're not bothered by the people next door. I taught in England for many years, and there the English have in public broadcasting even two kinds of shows. One, where it's how much things cost. The vase that your grandmother left you, how much it's worth. So reducing everything to exchange values. That's the high art one. And then they have another one of the other series, which is about real estate. And always it was the same aesthetic. They would go to the back garden and they would say, "Can you hear the cars?" "Oh, I can hear the cars." "That's no good. It's not a good house." Because you can hear, or the neighbors could see you from their windows in the yard. So that's not good. Maybe you have some horses, but you don't want the human beings being too close because... So this is a new aesthetic that has both. It's both, in many ways perhaps, a result of these new kinds of libidinal satisfactions that one gets from consumption. It's no longer the ancient Awry, where you go there and you discuss with people. And no. Now it's even you go there in the Whole Foods, how not to have to talk to people. And you see, it's a very, very significant transformation. That's why I try to avoid the Whole Foods. But by my bad luck, I happen to live very close to one, whereas the other ones are, you have to walk further, but I do my best. And so you have that significant transformation on the cultural level, and you also have the transformation on the level of the way that cities and suburbs are constructed. An increasing even of Athens was always a very urban city. It was, a lot of walking, very dense. It's a very sociable. People out in cafes all the time in the squares. Now again, you see even there, you see these significant transformations, and the little bakeries and butcher shops. They're not all closed, but they become less and less central, and these big supermarkets take over. Just as one illustration of the dynamic. But more and more, you have that kind of value. And not surprisingly, popular political sentiments become more and more, each person is on their own, right? In the United States and in Europe as well. Increasingly, there's a sentiment that because no longer now we have there's a weakening of the satisfaction we get from the community. More and more, it's us as individuals in opposition to the rest. Sometimes even The telephones, you see this, you know. The telephones, you see this too. Everyone, I take the subway, you know, to go to work. And then you go on the subway, everyone is looking down on their telephones. And you have these Wall Street bankers, you know, with the expensive suits playing these stupid games on the phone. You see what I mean? So this is whereas before they would read the newspaper or read a book or just sit there and, you know, you look around and you get some sense of where you are. You're in a, you know, this is the community. This is now that even there, even on the subway, things are mediated through the screens rather than people directly experiencing it as a kind of collective process. So this, I think, is one significant transformation. That those traditional displacements that had been true for a long time and that tied people in the community together in a very strong way become weaker and weaker and weaker. In large part because of the demands of Fordist capitalism to consume. And the effect that has both in terms of how we consume, and, you know, what we consume, the rapidity of the consumption, and what happens then in the mind. That, you know, you can't live in a suburban society and be immune to its ideological effects. It's there. So increasingly, I think in one way we could maybe measure that is look at the tendency for people to engage in non-self-interested behavior, which is on behalf of the community. I mean, if, you know, even the most simple things like propensity to join the military, let's say, right? Or people saying we have to sacrifice for the good of the country. Now, in the airports, they may have signs that say, you know, we support the troops and so on and so forth. But if there's someone who is very prosperous or is economic and then joined the military voluntarily, we say, well, something is wrong, right? There's some kind of, you know, something's going on there that's not, you know. Why? Because now, who goes there? People who think that's the best choice for them individually. It's the best job they can find. You get some money to go to school. It's a reasonable choice. When we talk about politicians, it's a given assumption that every politician is in it for themselves. Even notions of public virtue, that some people do it out of, like Max Weber, when he talks about politics of vocation, he says, well, there's a special type of person who's motivated by different things. They are the ones appropriate for political life. Now, there's no more, or at least it's weaker. It's an illustrative point that the study of political corruption, the main analytical model now is rational choice theory. So the presupposition is people in the political sphere function the exact same way as people in the market. Self-interested, utility maximizers. So it's simply a question of understanding, right, what those values are and how it works. So I have to go faster. So that's one area, right? We have a transformation in popular culture. The community ties become weaker, more individualized, more focused upon individual self-interested behaviors now, not behaviors that sacrifice short-term interests for longer-term stabilities and cohesion of the community. Second, related fundamental transformation is in the way that the temporal nature of capitalism. Now, capitalism had functioned in ways where the medium and long-term horizons were significant. So when Henry Ford or the others would develop the factories, they had projections about 30 years, 40 years down the line, you know, how the things may take place, the way the supplies worked. And increasingly, the time horizon of capital becomes shorter. And what we have now is, on the one hand, a great expansion of international cross-border exchanges. Now, just to give you some idea of how significant some of these changes are. If we look between 1975 and 1996, that 20-year period, and we measure cross-border transactions only in bonds and equities, we see an increase. In the U.S., for example, you have an increase from 4% of GDP to 151. In Germany, from 5% to 196. In Japan, from 1.5% to 83. And in Italy, from 1% to 435%. So through what some people call financialization, and through certain kinds of technical innovations having to do, of course, with the computers and how quickly you can move money around and all the rest, that's an important part of the picture. More and more, you have bigger and faster and more frequent exchanges in securities. And that was 1996. From 1996 to then 2006, you have a further increase of all cross-border transactions of roughly 300%. In the US, this is 302%. In the Eurozone, 283. In the UK, it's 354. And in the emerging markets, 371. To the point that in 2006, after Lehman Brothers, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, things took a dip. Now they're back up again, of course, but they took a sizable dip in 2007, 2008. By 2006, if we only look to long-term U.S. equities, purchases and sales of long-term U.S. equities in 2006, it was $52 billion. Where you had the annual, where as opposed to the annual world trade in goods and services, which was less than 30. So already by 2006, the main thing being exchanged, crossing borders, is not, of course, it's not, olive oil and, and Volkswagens. It's securities, bonds, loans to some extent. Why this is significant? This is significant because increasingly capital is deterritorialized, disembedded from societies. Whereas before, when you had, there's an important book by Rudolf Hilferding, who was, for a time in Germany, the finance minister, but he was a Marxist theorist. He wrote a very nice book, Finance Capital. And in Finance Capital, he argued that the divide between money capital and productive capital was gone. It was merged. And again, being close to Detroit, GM is as much a finance company as it is a manufacturer. And, Chase Bank does not, it happens with, right, its ties to, of course, productive capital. The banks and productive capital become merged. There's no longer a significant divide of interests or of, the finance is fundamental to the industry and vice versa in terms of realizing profits and so forth. Today, we have to come to the conclusion that's not the case. That what people refer to and talk about the financialization of capital has to do with increasingly capital becoming disembedded from society. So now the whole question is in terms of the movement, right? Going fast and a lot. And we try to get the profits not 20 years from now, 30 years from now, but 6 months, 12 months, 18, the most 24 months. The most is 24 months that they look ahead in terms of realizing the profits. Not in terms of the projections for growth, but in terms of realizing when you're going to make the money, it's all the short run. And there's increasingly weaker connections to the actual societies themselves. Doesn't matter. It's China, it's Africa, it's Greece, it's this or that. It doesn't matter increasingly. We have disembedded markets. For example, we could ask the question, why Germany, of all countries, would be pro-austerity? Why Germany, which is export-led in many ways, right? They produce many things, and they export a significant fraction of that. Why would Volkswagen and Bosch and all these big Siemens and all these big corporations be in favor of reducing consumption? And the Greeks and the Spanish, they buy the German things, or they're a big market, because increasingly it doesn't matter. And transnational capital, financialized capital, is hegemonic and dominant even in Germany, let alone, of course, Britain and the U.S. and the rest. So even there, you have economic interdependencies, But what happens in Greece or Italy or Spain is irrelevant from the standpoint of the process of extracting profits for transactional capital. So you have a decrease in the structural reasons why interdependency would lead to more cooperation and less conflict, antagonism, and you have a decrease in the subjective reasons that would happen, because you have this transformation of popular culture more focused on consumption, less on these cultural habits that tie people together, resulting in what I believe is a fundamental crisis of what Louis Althusser would call the extended reproduction of societies themselves, capitalist societies. You know, we know for a long time from people like Marx, Karl Polanyi, who was the first to note the importance of markets not being disembedded from societies in the Great Transformation, that the double movement he refers to obliged markets to address the concrete needs of the communities, and thus capitalism developed in a way that it was reproducible, sustainable. People didn't die or didn't revolt, you know, more directly. They were able to stomach the transformations, and it was able to occur. These things become more and more problematic because the state increasingly does not have the autonomy from economic interests to force them to think about the long-term reproductive needs of the society. People themselves have internalized and adopted forms of culture that mimic this embedded thing. You have, as an example, I was talking about this during lunch, the idea in contemporary societies of lifelong learning. And I don't know if here some of the or administrators or academics here like some of these. I mean, it sounds nice, the word, right? Lifelong learning, and when you're 60, you should read Aristotle, you know, because it's never too late. But they don't mean that, right? They don't mean read Aristotle. They mean you and I should all the time have our eyes on the labor market and modifying ourselves in ways so that we're useful to the labor market. You see? So if you work now if you're a teacher or you work in the auto plant, or even if you're academic, you should all the time be looking to make yourself more useful to the market. And if you don't, well, too bad for you. No, it's no longer that Dodge or GM say we have an obligation to train our members when things change, you know, or the markets more generally. If you don't have a job, it's your fault, because you didn't do enough. You didn't study the right degree. You studied anthropology, no good. No good. That means you're going to be unemployed, and it's your fault. They don't say increasingly there are no jobs because the way capitalism works, you have automation. My friend Stanley Aronowitz and Bill DeFazio have a very good book on this jobless future, where they make the argument that through automation, capitalism produces less and less demand for labor. Increasingly, we're going to live in societies with high levels of unemployment. That, I think, is a better explanation than, well, we don't have enough people with the right skills, so that's why they're... But it's internalized, and people jump off the bridges, you know, because these things happen. That's no good. So on many, many levels, then, these two broader dynamics lead to what I think, and we can maybe, you know, talk more about in the discussion, is a fundamental crisis in the reproducibility of contemporary societies. Things are going to increasingly fall apart. You see this very directly in Greece. Very, very. I mean, Greece is a prime example of this process playing out. Detroit is another maybe a good example of how this plays out. But increasingly, this is the kind of situation we're going to face everywhere. Maybe not Manhattan. Manhattan is, as David Harvey says, is the biggest gated community in the U.S., you know, Manhattan. But beyond Manhattan, you know, and maybe Ann Arbor, you know, in general, there's going to be a lot of problems. So we have time now for, right? Yes. It was fast enough? Absolutely. Yeah.